Hello, and welcome to Serial Knowledge Crimecast. I'm Brianna,
And I'm Meg.
and in this episode of Serial Knowledge Crimecast, we will dive deep into the mysterious 2010 death of Joanna Matouk Romain, a well-known and loved member of her community in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. Her case is filled with conflicting details, raising questions about whether Joanne's death was a tragic accident, a suicide, or something far more sinister. Joanne was last seen on the evening of January 12, 2010, near the icy banks of Lake St. Clair. Police initially classified her death as a suicide, claiming she walked into the water. However, Joanne's family believes there's more to the story, and it's fought to prove that she was a victim of foul play. In this episode, we will explore the strange circumstances surrounding Joanne's death, the evidence that points to a possible cover-up, and the ongoing efforts by her family to seek justice.
Then we will tackle one of the most shocking true crime cases in recent years, the tragic 2022 murders of 4 University of Idaho students in Moscow, Idaho. On November 13, 2022, the small college town was rocked when Kaylee Gonzalez, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were brutally murdered in their off-campus home. As the investigation unfolded, it left the public with more questions than answers. What was the motive behind the killings? How did the suspect evade capture for weeks? And could the gruesome crime have been prevented? In this episode, we examine the key events surrounding the case, the suspect, Bryan Kohberger, and the theories circulating around this devastating crime.
And now we will start with piecing together what really happened to Joanna Matouk Romain.
A little background on Joanna Matouk Romain was she was a mother of 3, a well-respected member of the Grosse Pointe community. She disappeared the night of January 12th, 2010. She was attending a 15-minute prayer service at her church that she went to all the time. Witnesses suggest that she left alone and did not seem distressed at all. She seemed like her normal self. Her car was found abandoned at the church, moved from where it originally was parked, and her purse, wallet, and keys were all inside. Brand new purse, and when that purse was found, it was as if somebody ripped it off of her.
That sounds like she was getting robbed.
Or in a fight with somebody.
Now, where was the lake compared to the church?
You could walk there pretty quick. It was pretty much like right across the street. I still don't think in the freezing cold when the lake was completely covered in ice that she's going to walk that distance just to go into the lake.
Yeah, and I find it odd that they're going straight from drowning to suicide because people drown accidentally all the time.
So her family believes that she would never harm herself. They said that she got along with everybody, got along with the family, and it led to some inconsistency in the police's version of events. The police theory is that Joanne walked into the lake and drowned by suicide, which led the family to doubts that they weren't investigating properly because the family does not believe that it was suicide. They believe that she was murdered. An officer went to Joanne's house at 9:24 to report her missing. 29 minutes after that, at 9:53 p.m., a lien was ran on her daughter's car. So it wasn't even her car. So how they reported her missing 29 minutes before even, I guess, knowing that that was her car, or not even her car. You know, it's just very suspicious.
That is odd that the first thing that they would do is say that it was her. I don't see anywhere that it said that the cops even went into the church to figure out whose car it was or anything like that, because that's the only way I think they would know it was hers.
Yeah, because that lien thing I found on that Facebook page. So that wasn't public knowledge when this whole thing came out.
That seems pretty strange to me that they would just jump straight to that conclusion.
Right. There were no footprints leading into the water. No signs of a struggle, no signs of foul play.
And no signs of foul play except for, I feel like that the purse being ripped could potentially be a sign of foul play that was overlooked.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I don't think that the cops really thought too much into that. There's nothing suspicious about a ripped purse. Joanne's body was found 70 days later in the Detroit River, which was 30 miles away from where she was last seen. So 30 miles from the church. It's very interesting to me because a body is not going to travel 30 miles by itself. Something had to have happened there.
Especially for that time of the year, because if the lake was icier, the lake was frozen. What I would think in my head is that if her body went into that lake, she would have ended up on the edge of the lake and they would have seen her.
I find this very interesting because even to this day, the police still are calling it suicide by drowning. So there was no water found in her lungs when her body was found, which means she didn't drown. But her body was so badly waterlogged and decomposed that they couldn't find an actual cause of death. So autopsy report could not come back with anything. So Joanne's family, to this day, claims that she was murdered and that the scene was staged to look like a suicide.
I feel like a lot of what they're seeing definitely is showing that there was something outside of a suicide that happened here. There's just a lot of things that are not making sense.
Absolutely. So Joanne's family members had ties to the police department, specifically her cousin Tim Matouk, who at the time was a Harper Woods police officer. Currently, he is an investigator for Wayne County's prosecutor's office. It was said that she had feared him nearing towards the end, although he claims that they've always had a good relationship. He swears to this day that he had nothing to do with it because he wasn't in the area when she disappeared. However, his phone pinged that he was 20 minutes away from where she disappeared. So he could have left his phone there, gone and done whatever, and then gone back. Or maybe he didn't have anything to do with it. This is all alleged.
I feel like as a cop, they know about airplane mode at this point and know how to turn their location services off, and he knows how to handle getting around to those types of things if he was involved.
In the time leading up to her death, there was stuff that had happened to her, and she was said to have told her daughter, if something happens to me, it was Tim. For somebody who never had problems with anybody, got along with everybody, to have said something like this means that she really was terrified that something was going to happen to her.
I feel like this also means that if he's saying that they had such a great relationship, why is she telling her family that if something happens to me, it was this person? I don't think anybody that has a regular relationship that is fine with somebody would say something like that for no reason.
I think that also goes back to the fact that the police are covering this up, allegedly, to make it still look like a suicide. None of it makes sense to me.
Yeah, and it seems like they just left it as, oh, it's a suicide, and they've never revisited it. But it's just weird because there are so many things that don't add up in this to make it definitively a suicide. It just doesn't really make sense because it's like there was no way to determine fully a cause of death, and obviously the death was not drowning related.
Right. And adding to the cover up, knowing that her jacket, now her family claims that her jacket, she never zipped it up. Her body being found with her jacket zipped up, it could be pointing somewhere else, you know? So there is one known witness from the night of Joanne's disappearance, and that was a man named Paul Hawk. Paul Hawk gave a description of Tim Matouk. The police deemed him not credible, and back in 2021, he was found dead in his home. Before that, he had claimed to have been harassed. His brother said he was healthy, but yet, again, cause of death was undetermined. So, knowing that this was the only known witness, and they can't identify how he died, and they couldn't identify how Joanne died, it is just very suspicious to me.
Yeah, and the fact that they haven't found this person that he says that he saw there on the scene and that they didn't take it seriously, that's an odd thing to not take seriously if there was potentially an eyewitness. Because, I mean, Paul Hawk's account of that evening could have led them to another potential witness that night had they found the person that he said that he saw. Even if that wasn't the person that was involved or anything, they typically in investigations you see that they want to know and speak to everybody that could have been in that area.
Right, absolutely. There also was one piece of evidence that was very interesting to me because Paul had said he'd seen somebody in this black scarf the night that Joanne disappeared. That scarf was put into evidence and then it was donated. I don't know about you, but from what I've experienced, anything that you put into evidence stays in evidence or gets destroyed.
It's interesting that they would donate a piece of evidence that could potentially link to a crime. It does make me wonder what their policies in that department are towards those kinds of things, because maybe they keep things for X amount of time and once the case has been considered closed, they release it. But it's still weird because it puts you in that position of like, from a policies and procedure standpoint, I understand why they probably got rid of it, but from like looking at it from the outside and seeing how much of this doesn't add up makes you wish that they still had that piece of evidence to look back on.
Right, definitely. This case continues to be an ongoing battle. The family is fighting to reopen the investigation. They have been struggling. They want this case to be treated as a homicide. And it is very clear that the police department does not want to investigate it. The family has hired private investigators to look into the death of Joanna and have still not been able to find out much more information. The public has been very interested in this. The media has been covering it like crazy. And they have their own podcast on this case. So this podcast basically covers everything from the beginning to ongoing information that is happening. I have been following their Facebook page since I heard about this case, and it gives you any information that you will need. One of the most recent developments after I saw this case on Unsolved Mysteries was they have been having a digital billboard truck around where Joanne had disappeared. And it's got all this information on it. In June, so a few months ago, Bill Matouk, which was her brother, crashed into the digital billboard truck. They believed it was intentional. He actually is facing charges now for it. So his charges include malicious destruction of personal property, assault with a dangerous weapon, lying to a peace officer, and failure to stop after a crash.
Didn't he back up and hit this digital billboard again after he already crashed into it the first time?
He did, yes. So to me, that just screams intentional. I'm going to encourage you guys to join that Facebook page so you can follow every little thing that comes up with this case because it is still unsolved. Really hoping to get this reopened as a homicide investigation instead of just keeping it closed as a suicide.
And listening to that podcast too, I think whether it be for information or specifically to support the family in their efforts, I feel like listening to the podcast, join the Facebook page are all really great venues to be able to support that family throughout finding out what happened.
So now join us as we break down the Idaho 4 murders, review the evidence, and explore whether justice is being served for the victims.
The Idaho 4 was the night of November 12th through 13th, 2022 murders of Kaylee Gonzalez, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. So the way that these four are interconnected, Kaylee and Madison are best friends, like childhood best friends, who are University of Idaho students. Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin are in a relationship. They'd been dating for a little bit. Ethan was a fraternity brother at one of the fraternities at the University of Idaho, but Kaylee, Madison, and Xana all lived in this 3-story house together they had 2 additional roommates, but one had moved out. So there were 4 people in total living in this house at this time, but actually, I guess that would make it 3 because Kaylee had recently moved out and she was only here this weekend to visit Maddie and show her this new Range Rover that she had just bought. On the night of November 12th, 2022, Kaylee and Maddie were out just kind of really doing regular college kid things. They were out at a couple parties, they went to a food truck, then they came back home and they were laying in bed together. Kaylee's dog was there. Xana and Ethan, it looks like they were at a frat party and the other roommate was at the house as well. So everybody ends up back at the house. about midnight, a little bit later than midnight. So in the early morning hours of November 13th, 2022, between 4 and about 4:25 a.m. is where investigators have been able to calculate when this happened. Someone broke into this home and went to the third floor and stabbed Kaylee and Maddie to death in Maddie's room. Then they went downstairs to the room where Xana and Ethan were, and they stabbed Xana and Ethan to death as well. On the way out, in the arrest affidavit, it states that the surviving roommate, who was still in the home, actually saw this intruder leaving. It was somebody with a mask over their face but bushy eyebrows, seen leaving this home. This roommate goes back to sleep, and then the next day around noon calls fraternity brothers whenever she wakes up and sees the scene and sees the blood and sees what's happened. The fraternity brothers come over, and then they call 911. Once 911 gets there, they discover the brutal nature of the stabbings. They began their investigation.
I can only imagine how that roommate was feeling, considering, you heard your friends screaming for help. They probably were screaming for help. And then to wake up the next morning and be like, oh my God, what just happened here? Like, could I have saved them?
Yeah, she stated in the arrest affidavit that she heard them, but I think it's really important to note that this is a party house. This is kind of a known party house for the University of Idaho. There's a lot of people in and out. So I think that the roommate potentially thought that this person was strange, but I also think that she potentially thought that this person was associated with one of the other people that lived in the house. And also, whenever they were making noise, she said that she went and she yelled for them to shut up. I think that noise was just normal in this house, and she did not feel that it was anything other than a typical evening party noise.
Yeah, and it leaves me wondering how she is still alive after this. Was that intentional?
Yeah, it's strange, and I think on social media, a lot of people have been very, very critical of this roommate because of that fact. Because everybody else was murdered except for the dog. Kaylee's dog was found locked in an upstairs bedroom, and the dog was pretty much the dog and the roommate, they are the only ones that survived this. And I do find it odd that the roommate was literally on the same floor, opened her door, saw this person, and still was able to make it out alive. There's some very odd things with the roommate, but I think that it's also important to note that there's a gag order on this case. And so the only information that we really have on the facts of this case are from what came out in the arrest affidavit from whenever the suspect was arrested. And other than that, we know nothing else. So there might be more information within the trial that will come out that'll explain more about the roommate. And I would be actually very, very interested to see what information that would be. So whenever the police began their investigation, there is a lot of confusion. I think that this created a lot of unrest within the community. I think that this scared a lot of people. Students were just naturally absolutely shaken to their cores in this community because this is something that just does not happen on the University of Idaho and in this community. Now, this town, Moscow, Idaho, is so small. It really is just a very collegey town. So I think everybody has that feeling of security and safety. And this is an off-campus house, but it's surrounded by fraternities, and there's just not much that happens around there besides college kids enjoying college. As the investigation continues, people start becoming pretty critical of this small town police department, questioning if they are able to handle a case of this magnitude because the police are not giving updates. Time is going and time is going, and we're getting into December. There seems to apparently be no suspects. There seems to be no legitimate clues that are leading them to any sort of discovery. There are people that are becoming Facebook and internet investigators that are saying that it was this person, that it was this person, and here's why. And within these Facebook pages, it's just becoming a blame game towards people that are actually innocent. And it's ruining these people's lives. And one of them being the ex-boyfriend of Kaylee. People on the internet were saying that it was him, that it had to be him because he was basically this bitter ex-boyfriend. And it comes out that it's not him. This man is still trying to grieve the loss of his ex-girlfriend. People are just being horrible online towards him. So a white Hyundai Elantra becomes a critical piece of evidence because it is seen driving around this house the evening of the crime. The white Hyundai Elantra is put out in the news, and the Washington State University security calls the Moscow Police Department and says that they have a white Hyundai Elantra matching the description that belongs to a criminology PhD student. Now, this student has no apparent criminal history, but whenever they start looking into him, the cell phone data starts matching up. They eventually arrest on December 30th, 2022 in Pennsylvania, Bryan Kohberger. So here's what I found to be pretty interesting. The cops were able to make a familial DNA match based off of a knife sheath that belonged to a K-bar that was found on the bed where Maddie and Kaylee had been murdered. The DNA on this knife sheath was familial to Bryan Kohberger. After this DNA match was made, the Washington State University tip about the white Hyundai Elantra led the Moscow Police Department to keep looking further into Bryan Kohberger. Now it showed that his cell phone had pinged to the house multiple times on the days leading up to the murders. Now I find this to be incredibly interesting because of the fact that from the outside perspective, Bryan Kohberger didn't know these students. Bryan Kohberger is 28 years old, a PhD student. Xana and Ethan were 20 years old. Kaylee and Maddie were 21 years old. It didn't appear that they really had any interactions, so there's still a big question mark surrounding this case of how they even knew each other. But through these DNA matches and these cell phone pings, the police felt that they had enough to initiate the arrest in Pennsylvania on Bryan Kohberger. Now, Bryan Kohberger had driven this white Hyundai Elantra from Washington to Pennsylvania with his dad around Christmas time of 2022 and stated that he was heading home for Christmas break. Some people found this to be odd. I personally didn't find it that odd that he would go across for Christmas because I've personally done the same thing whenever I lived in a different state from my family. But I also could see where people felt like he was getting out of Dodge. On the evening of the murders, Bryan Kohberger's cell phone location had been shut off during the times of the murders, and then it picked back up outside of the town, showing him driving around in the middle of the night. Now, whenever the courts asked for the defense to submit the alibi, Bryan Kohberger stated that he just likes to drive around at night.
Which, I mean, I get that. There's people who like to drive around just to, enjoy the scenery and stuff like that. But to me, it's a little bit suspicious how his phone turned off and then very randomly outside of town turned back on.
Well, and also later night drives I don't think are typically at like 4 or 5 in the morning.
Which is true. I mean, I feel like, if you can't sleep, maybe you'll sit around and go for a drive. But 5 o'clock in the morning, because it was probably about 5 o'clock in the morning at that time, suspicious time to go just for a night drive. Be one thing if you're like going to work or something, because people do get up that early for work.
Yeah, and one of the things that I find odd here, from the outside, there appears to be such a lack of motive on the part of Bryan Kohberger. After Kohberger was extradited from Pennsylvania, he was sent back to Latah County, which is where Moscow is. Now, the Moscow County courthouse and jail is literally connected. There's about 30-something cells that are located under the courthouse, and that was where Bryan Kohberger had been being held up until September of 2024, before he was granted a change of venue to Ada County, which is where Boise, Idaho is, which is like 200 miles away. The gag order remained in place, so we're going to have to be waiting until the actual trial comes around to be able to figure out what the motive is, potentially. I don't know if we're ever going to actually learn the motive. I think it's really important to note that Bryan Kohberger, again, is a PhD student in criminology.
Yeah, I think this is the ideal person to cause a murder because this guy's a PhD student. He knew what he was doing. Of course, he still claims that he is not guilty. And like you've said with the motive, there's no motive for it so far.
Yeah, and I think as a criminology student, you kind of almost learn how to be a criminal so that way you can catch criminals. It almost feels like there's an element of Bryan Kohberger testing the detectives and testing the cops to see if he could get away with this crime. It kind of felt like it was a game. And the reason that I say that is because through digital forensics, there is a Facebook account that's called Papa Rogers. Backpedaling a little bit here. Meg and I started to talk about this case because of a Facebook group called the Idaho 4 Case Discussion Group. And in this group, during the time right after the murder had happened, before any arrests were made or any actual legitimate suspects, there was a Facebook profile in there named Papa Rogers. Papa Rogers would pose questions into this group about why do you think that they left the knife sheath? Well, this was before the knife sheath was ever even discovered. And somebody asked why didn't they kill the dog? And Papa Rogers said maybe they just liked dogs. Now, this led people to become suspicious of the Papa Rogers account. So it's been thought that this Papa Rogers account could potentially be Bryan Kohberger. Again, because this is just internet talk, this is all alleged, there's nothing definitive here. But Papa Rogers has not posted since the day that Bryan Kohberger was arrested back in December of 2022.
I definitely think that we can add that to the suspicious list, because for somebody who knew so much about a case that like a lot of the stuff wasn't even released to the public at that time, it screams guilty that Papa Rogers was Bryan Kohberger. Because how do you just go silent the day that you're arrested or the day before you're arrested?
Well, and even the profile picture here was like an AI generated. It looked kind of like a soldier that also resembled Bryan Kohberger. The person that was behind this account was also super condescending towards people. And I don't know if you remember, Meg, but they actually ended up getting themselves kicked out of that group because of how shitty they were towards people. They were just fighting with everybody all the time.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And then they went and they made their own Facebook group to talk about the case. But that Facebook group never went anywhere because this happened like the day before the arrests.
It's all alleged, but
It's very coincidental.
definitely.
So I guess on to kind of how the social media fueled the speculation. You know, that we've talked about it a little bit already, was just that the spread of misinformation with this case has been crazy. Like I said, there's a gag order, so whatever is in the arrest affidavit is the only information that we have right now that is tried and true. And that includes, like I said, the cell phone data, the knife sheath, the roommate's eyewitness testimony here. So, other than that, people are just coming up with theories. Like, there is just things coming out of left field that people have come up with this whole time.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the theories that I had heard, and in a way, I'm not gonna lie, I kind of started to believe it, was that the surviving roommate had a part in it. That was a major speculation.
I feel like whenever it comes to something like this, our brains want to make it make sense. And I think that the oddity of somebody being in the house where everybody else was murdered, but you're not, your brain, I feel like, would naturally go to, well, why weren't you involved? If you weren't murdered, you had to have been working with somebody, and like, why? And people just automatically looked at her with suspicion.
Another theory that I had heard was that Hyundai Elantra had been seen around that house before, and that whoever was in that Elantra was stalking somebody in that house.
Well, and the cell phone data did show that he had been around that house a couple times leading up to it. I also saw on the stalking thing, he had potentially been at the restaurant that Maddie had worked at.
Yeah, I remember seeing that too, and I think that was also in the group as well.
But there's also been speculation that because Kaylee sustained more injuries, that she was the potential target of this and everybody else just kind of happened to be there. But they were saying that there's potentially Instagram messages from Bryan Kohberger where he had been stalking Kaylee specifically, and that is why this happened, was because she had rejected him. From the scope of the injuries, I feel like I could agree that there was definitely a target. I don't think that it was a crime to see if you could get away with it. I think that there was somebody in the house that he was going after.
Yeah, I think that Maddie could have possibly been that target, and the only reason that the others were murdered is because they tried to come in between this killer. You know, he had to stop them. With that other roommate coming out from her door, maybe he didn't hear her, maybe he didn't see her, and that's why she's alive. Maybe they didn't think that she really had seen much, so, I'm gonna let her live, stuff like that.
Somebody stated too that maybe he had tunnel vision at that point. Whenever he was coming out of the house through that, like just the sheer adrenaline, that maybe he did not see her because the layout of the house is it's a very strange layout to the house.
Yeah, I mean, with the way they said that the crime scene was like basically nothing they'd ever seen before, I feel like if you're going on a murder spree, you're just at the end of it, you're just like gone.
So specifically speaking on Ethan and Xana was found between the bed and the wall leading to the outside of the house. Ethan was found in the doorway of that room. So, what it seems like potentially could have happened there was that Ethan had confronted Kohberger in the home. And that is part of why Ethan and Xana also were murdered during this time. There's a heavy potential that the altercation could have caused Bryan Kohberger to get a little bit sloppy whenever he was leaving. But also, it makes you wonder, how in the world could you have left a knife sheath at a crime scene with your DNA on it?
If he was smart, he would have made sure he had it. But also, like, could it have been left there on purpose? I don't think so, but you don't know what goes through people's heads. Especially knowing about the Facebook post from Papa Rogers and the knife sheath, that he knew about that before the public even knew about it,
Mm-hmm.
makes me think that maybe it was left there on purpose. Maybe he didn't realize he left DNA on it. Maybe he thought that he cleaned it off properly.
Yeah. Now, knowing what I know, if Papa Rogers is him and knowing what I know about the case and things like that, it really does feel like it was intended to be almost a test. Like I said, the things that Papa Rogers was questioning and the things that Bryan Kohberger did were very odd. Whenever he was being watched in Pennsylvania, they were watching him clean out his car, and he was throwing trash away in like the middle of the night in his neighbor's trash can, and the police went over and collected that trash. We don't know what was in that trash, but we do know that that happened. So now that the change of venue has been approved to Ada County, Bryan Kohberger moved there in September. What I found to be interesting about Ada County is that they are very good about these change of venue, high profile crime trials. They actually just did the trials of Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow. So Ada County is a lot more equipped to handle the media, the security. They're able to handle these higher profile cases. And I think that this is going to be really good all around for this because it's going to remove the stress of having such a major trial off of the city of Moscow, Idaho. I just genuinely don't think that they're equipped to handle something of this size.
Yeah, I mean, we have to remember that it's a small college town, and that whole university was just torn and distraught over these murders. It would be too much for them to handle, I think.
Exactly. And this has already been such a media circus for them in that city. The home has already been demolished, which I find to be unusual given the fact that the trial date hasn't even been set yet. But there's videos from before the home was demolished of Nancy Grace out there.
Yeah, I think that's just proving that I guess they've gotten all the evidence that they need from that house. With Bryan being arrested, they had to have had enough evidence on him to prove that he's guilty. They've gotten everything that they could possibly need going forward.
So now from the defense side, I think that the defense is really happy about this change of venue because you have a fresh potential jury pool. And in Moscow, I think that they would be really hard pressed to find somebody that was not affected by the crime. I think that everybody there would have some connection to this crime. So I think that the defense was really pushing for this so that way they could get a fair trial. I don't particularly know if they would have had the opportunity for a fair trial in Moscow. Now, the latest hearing after Bryan Kohberger was moved to Ada County, it's nothing super crazy, but they did do a hearing on if he was allowed to wear street clothes to pre-trial hearings. Back in Latah County, he was allowed to wear street clothes to all the pretrial hearings. In looking up about this hearing, there's no actual law that states that you have to allow somebody to wear street clothes to pretrials. Now, you do have to allow them to wear street clothes to the actual trial. And so the defense is really pushing for that. And on the September 26, 2024 hearing, the judge ruled in Ada County that it was going to be on a case-by-case basis. He was going to need to discuss with the security detail on whether that would be acceptable, depending on what the hearing was going to be. Now, the families of some of the victims of this crime are not happy about that because they want him to look like a killer. The defense does not want this because they want to give the presumption of innocence. They don't want a potential juror to see him in an orange jumpsuit and think that he's guilty. I think that from a legal standpoint, we have to remember that these people are innocent until proven guilty. So if he wants to wear street clothes, I think that he should be allowed to wear street clothes. I don't think it's that much of an issue for pretrial hearings.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, innocent until proven guilty, no matter how much evidence they have on you.
Yeah, and at this point, we don't even know. We don't know how much evidence
Right.
they do have, which I think is where the lore of this case is. There's nothing that we have that says that this is exactly what happened, how it happened, and why it happened. And it's going to take until the trial to figure out what is going on here. So the last update for this will be that the Latah County Court had originally scheduled the actual trial for the summer of 2025. When they moved to Ada County at this hearing on the 26th, the judge asked for an ad hoc meeting to follow because he wanted to discuss the date of the trial. Now, they do not want this trial to happen in the summer because it's expected that this trial is going to last about 3 months. So, what they're wanting to do is either move this trial before the summer of 2025 or after the summer of 2025 because you're looking at jurors and other people that are involved that are going to miss their entire summer to try this case. I personally hope that this case will be tried before the summer of 2025, but I realistically think that it's going to be tried after just because there's so much going on and there's so many delays that have already happened.
You know, I'm hoping for a before summer trial because I don't know how much longer I can wait.
I know, and imagine how the families feel for these
Yeah,
people. Is for the victims of this case, the families have to be just so ready to have this closure and to have their time in court to be able to get justice for their children. I mean, this has been going on for so long, and I know that the families will never be able to heal, but I think having this at least behind them will allow for them to be able to finally take that next step.
I definitely agree. Join us on the next episode of SKC, where we dive into the unsettling world of killer culture, where infamous murderers are romanticized, even idolized. We'll explore the psychology behind the Stark fascination, the role of media in glorifying violent criminals, and the dangerous impact it can have on real world justice. From fan mail to cult followings, join us as we dissect why some people fall in love with society's worst